The morning breeze swept through the quiet streets of Havenbrook, a small town nestled in the heart of Arizona. The storefronts, some with more than 50 years of history, reflected the golden light of the rising sun. In the town's center, a man walked in silence, guided by a large, imposing dog. John Carter, a former Marine who had lost his sight in Iraq, moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had once navigated the most dangerous terrains in the world. But war had left its mark, not just on his body, but deep in his soul. At his side, Max, his loyal guide dog, trotted with disciplined precision. Max was more than just a companion. He was a war hero in his own right, trained to detect threats and save lives under enemy fire. In the battlefield, John had trusted Max with his life. Now, in the supposed safety of civilian life, that trust remained unshaken. Havenbrook was a town where everyone knew each other, where respect was built over generations. But this morning, an unfamiliar sound disrupted the town's peaceful rhythm. The distant roar of motorcycles grew louder, rolling in like an approaching storm. John stopped at the curb, his head tilting slightly as he listened. Max's ears perked up, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The air seemed to grow heavier. The Black Vultures had arrived. A notorious biker gang known for violence and extortion, they left destruction in their wake wherever they went. Havenbrook had, until now, been untouched by their presence. That was about to change. John took a slow breath, his fingers tightening around Max's harness. He didn't need sight to understand what was happening. He could hear the motorcycles slowing down, their engines rumbling aggressively as they rolled into town. The sound of leather boots hitting the pavement followed. Deliberate, heavy footsteps. The kind that announced dominance. Then came the first voice. "Well, well, look at this," a man sneered. "A blind man and his dog. Looks like Havenbrook's got a new mascot." John remained still, his grip firm but composed. He had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than words. A second voice, rougher and laced with amusement, joined in. "Think he even knows we're talking to him? Maybe he's deaf too." Laughter erupted from the group, a sound that sent a ripple of unease through the nearby shopkeepers peering out from their windows. John knew men like this. He had faced worse in war, men who thought power came from numbers, from intimidation. But there was a fundamental difference between the battlefield and the streets of Havenbrook. Here, John was not a soldier anymore, but he was still a fighter. Max let out a low growl, his body tense, sensing the threat. A sharp sound followed, the crack of a boot against the pavement, close, too close. Then the unmistakable shuffle of movement as one of the bikers stepped into John's personal space. "You lost, old man?" the first biker Trigger taunted. "Or just waiting for someone to hold your hand?" John didn't flinch. "No," he said, his voice calm, "but maybe you are." The laughter died instantly. The silence that followed was thick with tension, as if the entire town held its breath. Trigger took another step closer. Max bristled, his growl deepening. "What's that, Grandpa?" Trigger spat. "You talking tough when you can't even see who you're up against?" Another biker chuckled. "Maybe we should teach him a lesson, show him what happens when you mouth off to the wrong people." John could hear the shift of weight, the telltale movement of leather and denim, the faint clink of metal, maybe a chain, maybe a knife. The years of training never left him. They lived in his muscles, in the way his heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Max suddenly lunged, not attacking but blocking, his large frame pressing against John's leg like a living shield. Trigger took a startled step back. "The hell's wrong with your mutt?" John exhaled, slow and steady. Max doesn't like cowards. The insult landed like a gunshot. A beat of silence, then the inevitable retaliation. One of the bikers moved, a sudden, reckless kick aimed at Max. But Max wasn't just a pet. He had been trained for war. He dodged with precision, pivoting just enough for the biker's boot to miss, throwing the attacker off balance. John took a small step to the right, perfectly timed, causing the biker to stumble into the curb. The misstep sparked anger. "You little..." The biker started forward, but this time the sharp, commanding bark from Max froze him mid-step. Trigger scowled. "Enjoy your walk, old man, but don't get too comfortable." His voice lowered, dripping with threat. "We'll be seeing you real soon." The sound of retreating boots followed, then the growl of motorcycles revving to life. The Black Vultures hadn't finished. They were just getting started. John stood still, listening as the gang rode further down the street, their presence settling over Havenbrook like an oncoming storm. He reached down, running a steadying hand over Max's head. The town might not know it yet, but war had just come to Havenbrook, and John Carter wasn't about to let it win. The Black Vultures weren't the type to let things go. John Carter had felt their presence long before they even returned. There was a heaviness in the air, an unspoken threat lingering in the silence of Havenbrook streets. People were more cautious, their voices hushed when they talked about the new gang that had rolled into town. That night, the distant roar of motorcycles echoed through the darkness, circling like predators marking their territory. They weren't just making noise. They were sending a message. John sat on his porch, Max at his side, his ears perked up, body tense. "They're watching," he murmured, running a hand over Max's head. Max let out a low, warning growl. John didn't need sight to know what was coming. Trouble had a rhythm, and it was getting closer. The next morning, Havenbrook's tranquil normalcy had been shattered. At the general store, windows were smashed, the front door hanging off its hinges. The town's gas station had been hit too, graffiti scrawled across the pumps, the word "Property of the Black Vultures," spray-painted in bold red letters. But the worst was the baker's shop. Mrs. Langley, who had been running the place for over 30 years, stood in front of her shattered storefront, tears in her tired eyes. Her husband Tom was sweeping up glass, his hands trembling with suppressed rage. John heard the crunch of broken glass beneath his boots as he stepped closer. "They did this?" he asked. Tom exhaled sharply. "Bastards came in the middle of the night. Tore up the whole damn place." "They didn't take anything," Mrs. Langley added, her voice hollow. "Just wrecked it." John's jaw tightened. This wasn't about robbery. This was about control. They wanted the town to feel helpless, and it was working. People were gathering now, shopkeepers, workers, families, all standing in uneasy silence, their faces etched with fear. Max stood at John's side, silent but alert. The air was thick with something dangerous, helplessness, defeat. John could feel it, like a weight pressing down on the town. That's what the Black Vultures wanted, and John Carter had no intention of letting them have it. Later that afternoon, as John walked down Main Street, he heard them before he felt them. Motorcycle engines rumbling closer, slow, taunting. Then came the footsteps, heavy boots on pavement. "Hey, Grandpa," the familiar sneer of Trigger rang out behind him. "I told you we'd be seeing you real soon." John didn't stop walking. "You don't sound like the welcoming committee." Laughter. 4, maybe 5 of them. "Yeah, well, we thought about bringing flowers," another voice chuckled, "but figured you'd appreciate something a little more personal." A hand shoved John's shoulder hard. He didn't stumble, didn't react. Max tensed instantly, a deep growl vibrating in his chest. Trigger whistled. "You got yourself one hell of a dog, old man." John tilted his head slightly. "And you got yourself one hell of a death wish." Trigger's amusement faded. "You know," he said, stepping in front of John now, blocking his path, "it's not a good idea to piss us off." John stood still. Listening, Trigger's breathing, controlled but irritated. The others, restless, on edge, they were waiting for Trigger to make the first move. John smiled. "You already sound pissed." Trigger's jaw clenched. "I don't like smartasses." John's hand never left Max's harness. "You don't like a lot of things," he said, voice level. "Respect, honor, common decency." Trigger stepped closer. "You think you're tough, huh?" "I think you're wasting my time." That did it. Trigger lunged. Max reacted first. The dog moved like a trained soldier, stepping between them just as John sidestepped Trigger's swing. letting the momentum of the biker's own movement work against him. A slight shift of weight, a redirection of energy. John knew exactly where Trigger was now. His fist shot forward, catching the biker square in the gut. Trigger stumbled back with a choked grunt, more shocked than hurt. The laughter stopped. John could feel the air change. The next attacker moved in fast, the scrape of boots on concrete, the slight inhale before a strike. John turned at just the right moment, ducking under a wild swing. Max lunged, snapping his teeth close enough to send the second biker reeling back. Then came the third man. John heard him, pivoted smoothly, and drove an elbow into his ribs, sending him crashing into a wall. The fourth hesitated, and that's when the silence stretched. John stood tall, unshaken, his breathing steady. Trigger was coughing, still catching his breath. The other two backed away slowly. The fourth? He turned and ran. Trigger spat on the ground, his face twisted with rage. "You think this is over?" he snarled. "You don't know who you're messing with." John tilted his head slightly. "Then maybe you should introduce yourselves properly." Trigger's nostrils flared, his fists clenched, but he didn't move. He knew. John Carter wasn't some helpless old man. John Carter was something else entirely. With a final glare, Trigger turned on his heel and stormed off. The others followed, but the message was clear. This wasn't over. John exhaled, letting his stance relax. Max was still tense, his head high, eyes following the bikers as they disappeared. John reached down, running a steadying hand over the dog's fur. "Good boy." The street was quiet again, but John knew better. The war had begun. John Carter had been in wars before. The only difference between Havenbrook and Iraq was the terrain. But the enemy? They were the same. The Black Vultures weren't done. The moment Trigger and his men had walked away, John knew what would come next: retaliation. They had lost face in front of the town, and men like them. They didn't let that stand. John didn't need to see to know eyes were on him now. People had watched. Whispers were already circulating around town. The blind veteran fought them off. He barely even moved. What the hell did he do to Trigger? By the time he made it home, the tension was thicker than the desert heat. Max paced the porch, restless. He felt it too. Trouble was coming. That night, the bikes returned. John heard them in the distance first, circling like wolves around a wounded animal. Except he wasn't wounded. He was waiting. Engines revved, tires screeched, then the gunshot. Not at him, at his house. The sharp shatter of glass followed, the bullet ripping through his front window. Max barked, low and dangerous, pressing against John's leg. John didn't flinch, didn't move. Instead, he listened. The roar of engines faded just as quickly as it had come. They didn't stop, didn't step onto his porch. No, this was just a warning, a promise. Next time, they wouldn't miss. By morning, the whole town knew. The sheriff, Bill Landry, was parked in John's driveway by sunrise, his truck door slamming shut as he stepped out. Bill was a good cop, but he wasn't stupid. He'd heard the rumors. He knew who the Black Vultures were. And worse, he knew who backed them. "You all right, John?" Bill asked, stepping onto the porch. John sat in his rocking chair, Max lying at his feet, alert but calm. "Bullet missed me," John said simply. "Missed Max, too." Bill exhaled, rubbing his neck. "That ain't the point. The Vultures, they don't play by the same rules, man. I need to know. Do I have a problem here?" John turned his head slightly toward the sheriff. "That depends." "On what?" John's lips pressed into a thin line. "On whether you're actually gonna do something about it." Silence. Bill sighed, his boots scuffing against the porch as he leaned against the railing. "John, you know how this works. The Vultures ain't just some punks raising hell for fun. They got money behind them, protection. You think they're scared of me?" "They're scared of something," John murmured. Bill narrowed his eyes. "And what's that?" John leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "They don't know what I am yet." That hit different, and Bill knew it. His jaw clenched. "You planning on handling this yourself?" John didn't answer, because they both already knew. That afternoon, John made a decision. He wasn't going to wait. He was going to strike first. He needed help, and he knew exactly who to call. John's phone had barely rung twice before the deep, familiar voice came through. "John?" The man on the other end said. "Been a long time. Mike, I need you in Havenbrook." A pause, then. "What's going on?" John exhaled. "Gang moved in. Black Vultures. They're running the town into the ground." Mike Reynolds, former Marine, same as John, same unit, same hell, went silent for a moment. "You need backup?" "I need a team," John corrected. Another beat of silence. Then, "I'll be there by tomorrow, and I'm not coming alone." John hung up. His fingers ran over Max's fur. Now it was a fight. Now it was war. Mike Reynolds was the kind of man you didn't forget. When his truck pulled into Havenbrook, it wasn't alone. John stood on his porch, listening as 3 more engines followed behind. The moment Mike stepped out, John already knew the war had changed. Mike was bigger than before, shoulders broader, voice rougher with time. "You look like hell, old man," Mike called out, a smirk in his voice. John huffed. "You sound like you still owe me $50. Mike chuckled, clapping a hand on John's shoulder. "Hell, maybe I do. You gonna collect?" "I'll collect when this is over." John's attention shifted as the others stepped out. 3 more men, all of them built for war. Frank Dawson, former Marine sniper, Cole Ramirez, demolitions expert, and Eddie Doc Morgan, the closest thing they had to a medic. Mike jerked his thumb toward the men. They heard the word Black Vultures and figured they'd come do a little house cleaning. John tilted his head slightly. "How much trouble are we in?" Mike exhaled. "Enough." They walked inside, Max padding alongside them. John didn't waste time. "They're running drugs," he said, "extorting businesses, towns scared. And last night," his voice dipped lower, "they put a bullet through my house." Silence. Then Cole let out a low chuckle. "Guess that means we're staying, huh?" Mike's face hardened. "Oh, we're staying, all right," he muttered. John turned toward his old friend. "They think they own this town," John said. Mike nodded. "Then it's time we remind them what happens when you mess with the wrong people. The Black Vultures had no idea, but their war was already lost. Havenbrook wasn't ready for a fight. The quiet of Havenbrook was an illusion. Beneath the stillness, beneath the relieved smiles of shopkeepers and the cautious optimism of townsfolk who dared to believe things might change, the storm was already forming. The Black Vultures had been embarrassed, and men like them didn't forget humiliation. They let it fester, let it grow into something violent. John Carter could feel it in the air. The last few nights had been too quiet. No engines roaring down Main Street, no shattered windows, no threats whispered to frightened business owners. The vultures weren't gone. They were waiting, planning. John sat on his porch, Max lying at his feet, ears twitching at every sound in the distance. The dog could feel it too. Something was coming. "You ever get that feeling?" Mike asked, stepping up beside him. John didn't turn. "Like we're sitting on a landmine?" Mike smirked. "Yeah, that one." Frank, always watchful, leaned against the railing. "They've been quiet, too quiet." Cole, ever the blunt one, huffed. "They're pissed. We humiliated them in front of the whole town. You don't let that slide." John exhaled slowly. "Then we prepare." Mike nodded. "We already started." The past few days had been spent fortifying the town. Surveillance cameras were discreetly installed at every major street. Locals were taught how to communicate without using phones, because if the Vultures had connections in law enforcement, John wasn't about to let them listen in. Most importantly, people had started standing up. The fear was fading, and that meant only one thing. The Vultures would have to make an example of someone. The attack came at 2:34 a.m. John knew the exact time because he was already awake, sitting at his kitchen table, running his hands over a map of Havenbrook, planning. Then Max growled, deep, low, warning. John's head tilted slightly. Engines, not loud and reckless like before, controlled, organized. Then boom! The shockwave hit first, rattling the windows, shaking the floor beneath his boots. Max barked, but John had already moved. Another explosion, this one even closer. Then came the gunfire. Mike stormed into the room, shirt half-buttoned, pistol already in hand. "They're here." John was already moving. Cole's voice cracked through the radio. "They hit the general store. I see flames. Shit, it's bad." Frank followed. "Gunmen near the gas station. I count 6, maybe more." John's mind worked faster than his body. They weren't just attacking. They were taking out resources. The store, food, supplies, the gas station, fuel, mobility. They were crippling Havenbrook. "Get your gear," John ordered, grabbing his rifle. "We end this." John moved like a man built for war. He and Mike cut through the back streets, Max at his side, senses sharp. By the time they reached the general store, flames were licking up the sides of the building. "Tom's inside!" a voice shouted. John didn't hesitate. He went in. The smoke was thick, suffocating. John moved fast, relying on memory, instinct, training. He didn't need sight to know where the shelves were, didn't need sight to hear Tom's coughing near the counter. "Tom!" a weak voice answered. "Here!" John found him fast, dragging him up, guiding him toward the door. Then came the gunshots. Outside, close. Max snarled, pressed against John's leg, sensing the danger. John pushed forward. They burst through the back door, smoke trailing behind them. Then came the impact. A bullet tore into John's shoulder, not a clean hit, but enough to knock him sideways. Max lunged. A scream followed. Gunfire erupted. Then silence. Mike's voice cut through the chaos. "John?" John exhaled, pressing a hand to his shoulder. "Still here." The fight raged through the town. Frank took the gas station, sniping 2 vultures before they could set the place ablaze. Cole fought 3 men near the mechanic's shop, breaking one's jaw before sending the other 2 running. Mike and John held the general store, driving back every bastard who dared approach. By the time the sun started rising, Havenbrook was in ruins. Buildings burned, windows shattered. But the Black Vultures, they had failed. They wanted to break the town, but all they did was harden it. John sat in Emma Green's diner, his arm in a sling, watching as people cleaned up the wreckage. Mike sipped his coffee. "They overplayed their hand," John nodded. "Now they're desperate." Cole leaned back. "That means they're going to get reckless." Frank glanced toward the street where a few locals, men who had once been afraid to even look at a vulture, were now armed, patrolling in groups. "They don't own this place anymore," he muttered. John exhaled. "Not yet," because he knew what was coming. The real fight. The vultures had lost the battle. Now they would come for war, and John Carter would be waiting. That was the first thing John knew he had to fix. The town had spent weeks cowering, watching as the Black Vultures took everything, their money, their businesses, their dignity. John had seen the same thing in war zones before, a community too beaten down to believe in itself, too scared to fight back. But that was about to change. Mike Reynolds and his team hadn't come to Havenbrook for nothing. They weren't here to play defense, they were here to turn the tide. And John Carter? He was ready to lead the charge. The first step was gathering intelligence. John sat at the old diner on Main Street, Max at his feet listening. That was something most people didn't do enough of. Listen. He heard every whispered conversation, every cautious exchange between the townsfolk. They were scared, but they weren't blind. People knew things, and when they thought no one was paying attention, they talked. The waitress, Emma Green, was nervous when she refilled John's coffee. He could hear it in her breathing, in the way her hands trembled slightly against the ceramic cup. "They came through here last night," she muttered under her breath, her back to him, acting as if nothing was wrong. "Vultures, 5 of them, sat right where you are now." "What were they saying?" John asked, keeping his voice low. Emma hesitated. They're planning something. Said something about a warehouse out past Route 19. Don't know what, but it sounded big. John's jaw tightened. Route 19. That meant drugs. He turned slightly toward the counter where Tom Langley, the baker whose shop had been trashed, sat nursing a cup of coffee. "They've been pushing people harder," Tom muttered, not looking up. "Raise the protection fees again. If folks don't pay, well, you saw what happened to my place." John nodded, taking it all in. The Vultures weren't just flexing muscle anymore. They were squeezing Havenbrook tighter, draining the life out of it. And that meant only one thing: they were getting desperate. John met with Mike and the team at his house later that evening. The moment Mike walked in, John could feel the energy shift. "You were right," Mike said, dropping into the chair across from him. "Warehouse out past Route 19. We scouted it today. They're running full operations from there. Drugs, weapons, probably even cash reserves." John exhaled slowly. "How many men?" Frank, the sniper, leaned forward. "We counted at least 10 inside. Maybe more rotating in shifts. Security's not tight, but it's enough." "That means they're comfortable," John murmured. Mike nodded. "They think they own this place. Think no one's stupid enough to come after them." John ran a hand over Max's head, the weight of what they were about to do settling in. "Then we make them uncomfortable." The next few days were spent building their resistance. John and Mike met with local business owners, people who had lost too much already. They weren't fighters, but they were desperate enough to start pushing back. Tom Langley agreed to be the first. He refused to pay the Vultures their protection fee, making a public stand in front of his bakery. "They're going to retaliate," Tom muttered as he wiped his flour-covered hands on a rag. John nodded. "I know." Mike crossed his arms. "That's why we'll be here when they do." They didn't have to wait long. The Vultures rolled up that night, their bikes cutting through the quiet like a blade. Trigger led the charge, stepping off his bike with that same cocky swagger. Tom stood his ground, though John could hear his heartbeat hammering in his chest. "You owe us money, old man," Trigger sneered. Tom didn't answer. John did. "He's not paying," he said, stepping forward. Max was at his side, silent but bristling with tension. Trigger turned, his expression twisting into amusement. "You again?" John didn't respond. He moved. Before Trigger even realized what was happening, John's fist was already colliding with his gut. The biker let out a choked grunt, doubling over. By the time the other Vultures reacted, Mike and the team were already on them. Frank took out 2 men in quick, precise movements. Cole, built like a damn tank, slammed another to the ground. Eddie, despite being the medic, took great pleasure in dropping the last guy with a well-placed knee to the ribs. 4 Vultures were down before they even had a chance to fight. Trigger crawled backward, coughing, eyes wild. "You have no idea what you just did," he spat. John crouched next to him. "No, I think I do." Trigger's breathing hitched. "You just declared war," he hissed. John smiled. "No, you did." The next morning the town was different. People talked louder, walked with more confidence. The Black Vultures had been embarrassed in front of the whole town, and people noticed. But that didn't mean the fight was over. It meant it was just getting started. Mike sat across from John at the diner, arms crossed. "We've got their attention now," he said. John nodded. "They're going to hit back," Mike smirked. "Let them try." The war for Havenbrook had begun, and John Carter wasn't about to lose. The morning after the attack, Havenbrook was a town in mourning. Smoke still rose from the ruins of the general store, the gas station, and the mechanic's shop. The bakery's windows were gone, shattered by gunfire. Scorch marks stained the pavement where Molotov cocktails had ignited. The Black Vultures had come to break Havenbrook. They had failed, but they had left scars. John Carter sat outside Emma Green's diner, his left arm wrapped in a sling, his ribs aching from the fight. Max lay at his feet, ears twitching at every sound, his body still coiled with tension. Across the street, Mike Reynolds, Frank Dawson, Cole Ramirez, and Eddie Doc Morgan were helping clean up the damage. "You ever seen anything like this?" Emma asked, setting a steaming cup of coffee in front of John. John exhaled slowly. "Yeah." She hesitated. "And?" His grip tightened around the cup. "It usually gets worse before it gets better." Mike dropped into the seat across from him. "That's what I was afraid you'd say." John listened to the quiet of the town. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that came when people were holding their breath, waiting for the next hit. "They lost last night," Mike continued, keeping his voice low. "But they're not done." "No," John agreed. "They're going to come back, harder, angrier, sloppier." Frank leaned against the table, arms crossed. Then we need to hit them first, Cole nodded. Take the fight to them. John tilted his head slightly, thinking. Going on the offensive was the logical move, but that wasn't the issue. The town's not ready, he muttered. Mike frowned. Then we make it ready. John ran a hand over Max's fur. The fight wasn't just about them anymore. It was about all of Havenbrook. And if they wanted to win this war, they needed more than just 5 men. They needed the town to stand up, recruiting the town. By noon, John, Mike, and the others were standing in front of the church where the town had gathered. Dozens of people, business owners, mechanics, farmers, fathers, mothers, people who had lost something in the Vultures' rampage, people who wanted to fight back. John stood at the front, feeling their uncertainty. We stood up to them once, he said, voice calm but strong, and they tried to destroy us for it. A murmur spread through the crowd. They burned our stores, smashed our windows, shot at us in the middle of the night. Because they thought they could scare us. He let that hang in the air. They think we'll fold, he continued, that we'll take the beating and let them own us. His next words were steel. They are wrong. A few people nodded. Mike stepped forward. John's right. They came at us with fire and bullets. And we're still here. He looked around. But if we want them gone for good, we have to do more than just survive. We have to fight. Tom Langley, the baker, cleared his throat. How? John turned his head toward him. By standing together. He couldn't see their faces, but he felt their hesitation. Emma stepped forward. What do you need from us? John listened. This was it, the moment that would decide whether Havenbrook rose or fell. I need eyes on the town, he said. I need people watching the streets, guards at every major business. I need every shop owner to know how to call for help without using phones. Frank added, and if you're willing, I can teach you how to handle a weapon. More murmurs. John felt the shift before he heard it. One by one, hands rose. I'll do it, Tom said. So will I, Emma added. Me too. Count me in. John nodded. Havenbrook had just become a battlefield, and its people were ready to fight, preparing for war. Over the next 3 days, Havenbrook transformed. Frank trained a group of volunteers, shopkeepers, farmers, even the town's retired schoolteacher, on how to use rifles and shotguns. Cole and Eddie reinforced buildings, setting up barricades and hidden vantage points. John, Mike, and Max moved through every inch of town, listening, learning, feeling where the weak spots were. People took shifts patrolling the streets. Others watched the roads leading into town. By the time the third night fell, Havenbrook was no longer a town waiting for the next attack. It was a town ready to fight one. The Vultures' return. It happened at 2 a.m. Engines roared through the darkness, more this time, 15, maybe more. John was already awake, standing on the diner's roof, Max at his side. Mike's voice cracked through the radio. They're here. John heard them pull up on Main Street. Then came the voice. John Carter. Trigger. John could hear the anger in his tone. Come out here, old man. John didn't move. Then boom! An explosion ripped through the bakery. The radio erupted with voices. John clenched his jaw. The fight was on. The Battle of Havenbrook gunfire broke out first. From the rooftops, from the alleyways, from the people who had once been afraid but weren't anymore. John moved through the chaos, Max at his side, weaving between gunfire and shadows. He heard Frank's rifle crack from a rooftop, dropping a vulture before he could set fire to another shop. Mike took 3 men down near the gas station, his shotgun roaring in the night. Cole went straight through the center of town, fists and bullets sending vultures sprawling, and John moved with precision, feeling the battlefield shift around him. Then he heard the click of a hammer being pulled back. Don't move. Trigger. John froze, feeling the cold press of metal against his temple. I told you this wasn't over, Trigger snarled. John smirked. You should have pulled the trigger already. Max lunged, the gun fired, but missed. John moved fast, twisting Trigger's wrist, forcing the gun down and away. The biker shouted, swinging wildly, but John was already inside his defenses. A sharp elbow to the ribs, a twist, then the sound of a body hitting the pavement. Trigger groaned. John crouched beside him. "It's over," he murmured. Trigger spat blood. "Screw you!" John stood, listening to the fading sound of motorcycles fleeing. The Black Vultures were finished. Havenbrook was still standing, and John Carter, he had won his war. The morning after the battle, Havenbrook wasn't the same town anymore. It had survived. They had survived. Smoke still clung to the buildings, the bakery was half burned, bullet holes marked the storefronts, and blood still stained the streets where men had fought and fallen. But the Black Vultures were gone, or at least most of them. John Carter sat on the front steps of the diner, his injured arm resting against his chest. Max lay beside him, alert but calm. Across the street, townsfolk were helping each other, cleaning up, repairing what could be fixed, moving forward. Mike Reynolds stood next to him, arms crossed. "You hear what's been going around?" John nodded. "Yeah, they're saying Trigger ran," Mike muttered. "But Viper's still out there." Viper, the real leader of the Black Vultures. Trigger had been loud, cocky, a hot-headed thug who thought he was in charge. But Viper was different. He wasn't the kind of man to pick fights in bars or smash up storefronts just to scare people. He was smart, cold, and patient, and unlike Trigger, he knew how to bide his time. John exhaled slowly. "He's not done." Mike nodded grimly. "No, he's not." That meant Havenbrook wasn't safe yet, not until Viper was dealt with. A town under siege. By midday, the tension had returned. Even with most of the Vultures gone, people weren't celebrating. They were watching the roads, waiting, afraid. Viper had been silent, too silent. John didn't trust it. That night, the first sign of trouble came. A truck rolled into town, its engine rumbling in the darkness. Mike and Frank were already on the rooftops, rifles ready. Cole stood by the gas station, shotgun in hand. Eddie was posted near the school, protecting the families who had taken shelter there. John was waiting. Max sat beside him, ears twitching. Then the truck stopped. The driver's door opened. Footsteps. John listened, the way the boots hit the pavement. The weight, the careful, steady pace. Viper. A slow clap followed. Then the voice, calm, deep, unsettling. Well, you really did a number on my boys, Carter." John stood up slowly. "You did it to yourselves," he said. Viper chuckled. "I suppose that's true, but you see, there's one thing you forgot about men like me." John tilted his head slightly. "What's that?" "I don't lose." The truck's back doors swung open, and hell came pouring out. The final battle. The first gunshots shattered the night. Viper's men, not just the stragglers from the Black Vultures, but hired mercenaries, came out guns blazing. John moved fast, diving behind a car as bullets ripped through the street. Mike opened fire from the rooftop, taking down 2 men before they even realized where the shots had come from. Frank followed suit, his rifle cracking through the night. Cole rushed the gas station, cutting down 2 of Viper's men before taking cover. Eddie was protecting the school, keeping the families safe. But John was hunting Viper. He moved through the chaos, Max at his side, weaving between gunfire. He could hear Viper's voice, barking orders. "Take them out!" A mercenary rushed him, rifle raised. Max lunged first, taking the man to the ground. John didn't hesitate. He grabbed the fallen rifle, turned and fired a single shot. The mercenary went still. More gunfire rained down from above. Mike and Frank were keeping the others pinned. Cole charged forward, taking out 2 more men near the gas pumps. Then silence. Except for one set of footsteps, John turned toward the sound. Viper. "You don't have to do this," John said, keeping his grip firm on the rifle. Viper chuckled. "You really believe that?" "You lost," John said. "Leave now, and no one else dies." Viper smiled. Then he raised his gun. John fired first. The shot hit Viper's leg, sending him to his knees. His gun clattered to the pavement. John approached slowly, stepping over the wreckage. Viper laughed through the pain. "Go ahead, Carter, finish it." John lowered his rifle. "No," Viper frowned. "I'm not like you," John said. "You're going to prison. And when you get there, you'll realize something." Viper smirked, despite the blood pooling around his leg. "Yeah? What's that?" John's voice was calm. "You're nothing without your men." Viper's smirk faded. The fight was over, and Havenbrook had won. The aftermath. By sunrise, the battle was history. Viper was in custody. The last of the Black Vultures had been driven out, and Havenbrook, it was standing tall. People were fixing their homes, repairing their businesses. They had fought for their town, and they had won. John sat on his porch, Max resting at his feet. Mike walked up, a rare smile on his face. "You did it, old man." John shook his head. "No, we did. Because this wasn't just his victory. It belonged to every person in Havenbrook who had fought for their home. And for the first time in a long time, John Carter allowed himself to rest. Havenbrook had won its war. The Black Vultures were gone. Their leader, Viper, was behind bars, and the remnants of his gang had scattered, too broken to regroup. The town, once suffocated by fear, had begun to breathe again. But war had a way of leaving scars. John Carter knew that better than anyone. For the first time in weeks, the nights were quiet. No engines roaring down the streets, no shattered windows, no smoke rising into the sky. The townsfolk were rebuilding, hammering wood over broken storefronts, repainting signs, sweeping away the destruction that had once seemed permanent. But John wasn't sleeping. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was too loud. Max, ever vigilant, lay at his feet on the porch, his ears twitching at even the smallest sound. The dog felt it too, the unease, the tension that wouldn't go away. Because John knew something the town didn't. The fight wasn't over. Not for him. A town moving on. The next morning, John walked down Main Street, nodding at the people he passed. Emma Green waved from the diner, where a new window had just been installed. Tom Langley stood outside the bakery, a hammer in one hand, a coffee in the other. "Morning, John," he called out. John raised a hand in greeting. "Morning, Tom." The town looked normal again, but beneath it, John could hear the whispers. "They say Viper's locked up for good. But what if someone else comes? What if they try again?" John stopped near the general store, where Mike and Frank were talking with Cole and Eddie. "We need to make sure this place stays safe," Mike was saying. Frank nodded. "People fought hard for this town. We can't let it slip back into fear." John exhaled slowly. "Then we don't." Cole crossed his arms. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" John nodded. Havenbrook needed more than just a victory. It needed protection. The plan. That night, the meeting was held at the church, the same place where the town had first gathered, fearful and uncertain. Only this time they weren't afraid. They were ready to listen. John stood at the front, Max at his side. The room was full. Shopkeepers, farmers, workers, even kids who had seen too much for their age. "I don't need to tell you what we've been through," John began. His voice was steady, but heavy. "We all lived it. We fought for this town, and we won. But that doesn't mean the fight is over." Murmurs spread through the crowd. "We can't just hope nothing like this happens again," John continued. "We have to make sure it can't." Mike stepped forward. "That's why we're starting something new." The murmurs stopped. John scanned the room. He couldn't see their faces, but he heard their reactions. The rustle of movement, the way some people shifted forward. "Curious. We're forming a town watch," Mike said. "A real one. People willing to patrol, keep an eye out, make sure no one ever tries to take Havenbrook again." Emma Green was the first to speak. "Like a sheriff's department." John shook his head. "No, we're not law enforcement. We're not out here to be vigilantes. This isn't about starting fights." His voice hardened. "This is about finishing them before they start." A long silence. Then, one voice. "I'm in." Tom Langley. Then another. "Me too." Then another. By the time the night was over, Havenbrook had a town watch, and John Carter had a new war to fight. The first threat. 3 weeks passed. The watch was working. People took shifts patrolling the streets, checking in with local businesses, watching the highways leading in and out of town. For the first time in a long time, people felt safe. Then, on a Tuesday evening, something changed. Frank was the one who spotted it. "John," his voice crackled over the radio, "we've got visitors." John was already moving. By the time he reached the edge of town, the truck was parked near the gas station, its engine still running. 3 men stood beside it. They weren't vultures, but they weren't friendly either. Mike stood next to John, watching as the men lit cigarettes, talking quietly among themselves. "Recognize them?" Mike asked. John shook his head. "No." Cole, leaning against his truck, muttered, "They're watching us." John nodded. "Yeah, and they want us to know it." One of the men, tall, lean, with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "You John Carter?" John didn't answer. The man smirked. "Yeah, you're him. You're the one who took out Viper." John didn't move. The man took another step closer. "You made a name for yourself, old man. Word's gotten around." John exhaled. "And?" Scarface smiled. "And that means you've got attention. Not just from me." The silence that followed was thick. "People are talking about Havenbrook," the man continued. "The way you ran the vultures out, the way you fought. Some people like that. Some people don't." John's grip on Max's leash tightened slightly. Scarface flicked his cigarette onto the pavement. "I came here to deliver a message," he said. "More are coming." Mike shifted beside John. Cole's jaw tightened. Frank's hand hovered near his pistol. John's voice was calm. "Then you tell them this." Scarface raised an eyebrow. John stepped forward, his face inches from the man's. "You tell them I'll be waiting." Scarface held his gaze for a moment. Then he chuckled. "Yeah," he muttered. "That's what I thought you'd say." He turned and walked back to the truck. Moments later, the engine roared to life, and the vehicle disappeared down the highway. Silence. Then Mike muttered, "Well, that's not good." John exhaled. "No, it's not. Because the war for Havenbrook wasn't over. Not yet. And now something worse was coming. The warning had been delivered. John Carter had seen a lot of things in his life. War, bloodshed, the destruction of men who thought they were untouchable. He knew how these stories played out. The Black Vultures were only the beginning. Now the word was out. Havenbrook wasn't just some backwater town anymore. It was a symbol, a place that had fought back, and that meant people would come. The wrong kind of people. The calm before the storm. A week passed with nothing happening, but John didn't relax. Neither did the town. Every night the town watch patrolled the streets. Rifles slung over shoulders, shotguns resting in store windows, watching the roads. Every morning John walked through town, listening. The way people talked, the way they moved. Fear was creeping back in. Scarface's warning had planted a seed. And now, people were waiting for the next attack. Frank was the first to speak the words out loud. "They're testing us," he muttered, as they stood near the gas station one evening. Mike nodded. "Yeah, they want to see how we react." John exhaled, running a hand over Max's head. "Well," he said, "let's make sure they don't like what they see." The arrival. It happened 4 days later. John was in the diner, sitting at his usual booth, when he heard them. Engines, not roaring like the vultures used to, controlled, slow, deliberate. John straightened slightly. Max let out a low rumble, his body tensing beneath the table. The front door swung open. Emma Green stopped mid-step, her tray rattling slightly in her hands. 3 men stepped inside. They weren't like the vultures, no leather vests, no chains. They wore dark jeans, heavy boots, simple jackets. But John could feel the weight of them. These weren't drunks looking for trouble. These men were professionals. The one in the lead was tall, built like a fist wrapped in flesh. His dark beard streaked with grey. His eyes were cold, not angry, not cocky, just empty. The kind of man who had seen too much violence to be impressed by it anymore. He stopped at the counter, leaned against it, and spoke in a voice too calm. "Coffee." Emma nodded too quickly and moved to pour it. John kept listening. The second man, younger, thinner but wiry, sat near the door. His eyes never stopped moving. The third one, silent, broad, carrying a weight in his stance that told John he was probably ex-military, stood by the window watching the street. They weren't here for coffee. The conversation that changed everything. The bearded man turned, resting his arms on the counter. His gaze landed on John. "You're Carter," he said. John didn't move. And you are? The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Name's Rourke. Silence. You know why I'm here? Rourke asked. John took a sip of coffee. I have a guess. Rourke exhaled through his nose. Amused. Word travels fast, Carter. People talk. You made a lot of noise taking out the vultures. He tapped the counter lightly. That kind of thing gets attention. John set his cup down. And what kind of attention are you? Rourke's smile widened slightly. The kind that likes order. John said nothing. Rourke continued. The vultures. Bunch of punks. No control, no discipline. That's why they lost. But you had a system. He gestured outside where members of the town watch were patrolling. You turned this place into something. And now, people like me. He leaned forward slightly. We're interested. John didn't blink. Mike, standing near the back of the diner, shifted slightly. Cole's hand rested on his belt, close to his knife. Frank, outside, was watching through the window, rifle leaning against his shoulder. Rourke noticed. He chuckled. Relax. If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't be drinking coffee. John finally spoke. What do you want? Rourke swirled his drink. To make you an offer. The deal with the devil. Rourke set his cup down. There's a bigger world than Havenbrook, Carter, he said. Bigger players, bigger stakes. He motioned toward his men. We run things a little differently than the vultures. We don't smash windows. We don't light places on fire. That's bad for business. John exhaled slowly. And what is your business? Rourke smiled. Control. He let the words sit in the air before continuing. This town's already organized, already disciplined. You did the hard part for us. He leaned forward. We want in. John's jaw tightened. We're not for sale. Rourke's expression didn't change. I don't think you understand, Carter. You don't get to say no. The silence stretched. Then John stood. Max rose with him, his stance rigid, his ears perked. John adjusted his coat, then took a step forward. You don't get to threaten me in my own town. Rourke! The air turned heavy. Mike shifted. Cole's fingers tightened on his belt. Rourke held John's gaze for a long moment. Then he laughed, a low, deep sound. He stood as well, calm as ever. All right, he said, brushing off his jacket. That's how you want to play it? He turned to leave, but at the door, he paused, glanced over his shoulder, and his next words froze the room. You have a daughter, don't you? John's world stopped. The diner went silent. Max growled, sensing the shift. John didn't move, didn't blink, but his heart was a war drum in his chest. Rourke smirked. Yeah, thought so. Then he and his men walked out, and just like that, the next war had begun. The war for Havenbrook isn't over. Mike sat across from John later that night. The porch light buzzed quietly, and in the distance the town was still. You all right? Mike asked. John was silent for a long time. Then he said, They know about her. Mike exhaled slowly. We need to move first, he said. John nodded, because now this wasn't about the town anymore. Now it was personal. John Carter had been in many wars. Some were fought in the deserts of Iraq, where every breath could be your last and every step might trigger a mine. Others were fought in the streets, in the shadows, against men who thought fear was a weapon only they could wield. But this was different. Rourke had just made a mistake. He had made it personal. John sat on his porch, Max at his feet, the dog's ears twitching in the night air. The town was quiet, but John wasn't fooled. The enemy was already here. The meaning of a threat. Mike sat across from John, watching him carefully. We need to be smart about this. John didn't respond. Mike sighed. I know that look. John finally turned toward him. His voice was quiet, but lethal. They know about her. Mike exhaled. Yeah, I know. The words hung in the air. Words hung. John's daughter, Rebecca Carter, had left Havenbrook years ago, carving out a life far away from this town. But Rourke's words earlier that day, you have a daughter, don't you, had set John's blood boiling. That wasn't a throwaway comment. It was a promise, a line drawn in the sand. Mike leaned forward. We have two choices. We wait for them to make a move, or we move first. John clenched his jaw. Waiting isn't an option. Frank's voice cracked through the radio. Truck spotted coming in from the north. Looks like Rourke's boys. John and Mike were already moving. A message sent in blood. They reached the watch post at the edge of town. Frank was perched on a rooftop, rifle in hand, his scope tracking the approaching vehicle. Cole stood beside him, silent, tense, ready. "They're testing us," Frank muttered. "They're not moving fast, just watching." John's fingers curled into fists. "Then let's give them something to see." Mike nodded. John moved first. Slow, controlled. Max walked beside him, a shadow in the dark. The truck rolled to a stop, dust rising in the headlights. John heard the doors open, footsteps, 3 men. One of them lit a cigarette. Then they waited. John stepped forward, stopping just at the edge of the light. "You lost." The cigarette man chuckled. "Not at all." Silence. Then the man flicked his cigarette to the ground. "Rourke sent a message." John's stance didn't shift. "I got it." The man smirked. "No, not yet, you haven't." Then he nodded toward the truck. The doors swung open, and John felt the rage hit him like a bullet. Inside, blood stained the seats. A man lay slumped forward, bound, beaten, barely breathing. Tom Langley, the baker, one of the first people to stand up. John didn't move, didn't react, but something changed in the air around him. The man smirked. "We're just getting started, Carter." Then he turned back toward the truck. He never made it. John moved first. 1 step, 2. A knife slid from his sleeve, and before the man even realized what was happening, John's blade buried into his gut. The other 2 men barely had time to react. A gun was raised. Mike's shot rang out first. The second man dropped before he could fire. The third. Max lunged, taking him down hard. Then it was over. John wiped his blade clean, didn't even look at the bodies. His focus was on Tom. He and Mike pulled the man out, gently lowering him to the ground. His breath was shallow, but he was alive. Cole crouched beside them. "We need to get him to Eddie. Now." John nodded. Then he turned back to the bodies. Frank's voice came through the radio. "What do we do with them?" John didn't hesitate. "Send them back. The war gets ugly." The bodies were left on the highway just outside the next town. A message to Rourke. The next morning, Frank spotted 2 black SUVs parked outside Havenbrook's border. No one got out. They just watched, waiting. "They're deciding what to do next," Mike muttered. John exhaled. "Then we give them the answer." He turned to the town watch. "We're done playing defense." Striking first, John's team scouted every inch of Rourke's operations. Frank spotted a warehouse outside town, where Rourke's men were staying. Cole tracked their supply routes, who was coming, who was leaving. Eddie patched up Tom Langley, who would survive, but only barely. That night, they made their move. A small team. John, Mike, Frank, Cole, and Max. The warehouse was on the outskirts of the next town, guarded but not fortified. Rourke wasn't expecting a fight, which made it even easier. The first man never saw John coming. A knife to the throat. Silent. The second went down when Frank's rifle cracked in the dark. Cole kicked in the side door, shotgun barking as he cleared the room. Then came the explosives. Cole set them along the support beams. 2 minutes. That's all they needed. By the time Rourke's men realized what was happening, it was too late. John's voice was calm over the radio. "Light it!" Cole pressed the detonator. The warehouse exploded in fire and smoke. Rourke had just lost everything, and now he would come for blood. The final war begins. The next day, John knew what was coming. The SUVs returned, but this time, they didn't just sit there. They pulled into town, and Rourke stepped out. He wasn't smiling anymore. The street emptied as he walked forward, his men behind him. John waited. Then Rourke spoke. "I should have killed you the moment I walked into that diner." John's voice was calm. "You had your chance." Silence. Then Rourke exhaled. "This ends one way, Carter." John nodded. "Yeah, it does." The air in Havenbrook changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It wasn't the tension of waiting for an attack. This was different. This was war. John Carter stood in the middle of Main Street, staring at Rourke as the man stepped out of his black SUV, flanked by 6 men, mercenaries, not gang thugs. These weren't the reckless, undisciplined Black Vultures. These were killers. The street emptied as Rourke walked forward. Max stood at John's side, motionless but locked in, his deep chest rising and falling slowly. Rourke took his time. His boots crunched against the pavement, hands in the pockets of his dark jacket. He looked at the town, then back at John. "This isn't how I wanted this to go." John didn't say anything. Rourke tilted his head. "I gave you an offer. You refused. That was a mistake." John exhaled through his nose. "I've made a few." Rourke smirked. "You made one when you burned my warehouse." His face darkened. "You made another when you left my men on the highway." His tone dropped to something colder. "But the biggest mistake? You thought this town could survive without me." John let the words settle. Then, "I think Havenbrook's doing just fine." Rourke's smirk vanished. His jaw twitched. He took a step closer. John felt Mike shift slightly at his left. Frank was still on the rooftop, rifle ready. Cole and Eddie were spread out, watching from the shadows. They weren't alone, but that didn't mean this wouldn't get ugly. Rourke exhaled sharply. "Carter, let's stop pretending. You and I both know how this ends." John tilted his head. "Enlighten me." Rourke smiled. "I kill you." A long silence followed. Then John nodded once. "Guess we'll see." A war at sundown. Rourke didn't attack right away. He was too smart for that. Instead, he turned on his heel, motioning for his men to follow. "Tomorrow night," he called out over his shoulder, "after sundown." Then he climbed into the SUV, the vehicle rolling away in silence. The town stayed still. Then Mike muttered, "Well, that went great." John exhaled. "He's giving us time." Mike frowned. "To do what?" John looked toward the horizon where the sun was beginning its slow descent. "To prepare, fortifying Havenbrook." That night, Havenbrook became something else, a fortress. Every window was reinforced. Every alleyway was barricaded. Every single person willing to fight was armed and ready. The town watch was no longer just a group of volunteers. They were a militia now. And John Carter, he wasn't just a man protecting his home. He was a soldier again. Frank set up vantage points on the rooftops. Mike organized patrols, ensuring that no one could enter the town without them knowing. Cole and Eddie secured weapons, passing them out to the men and women willing to fight. John moved through the town, feeling it change beneath his boots. The people were tense, but they weren't afraid anymore. For the first time in their lives, they were standing their ground. And when Rourke came back, they would be waiting. The last sunset sundown came too fast. John stood at the center of town, listening to the quiet. The people of Havenbrook were hidden now, watching from windows, rifles resting on counters, waiting for the first shot. Mike stepped up beside him. "We're ready." John nodded. He could feel Max's tension beside him. The dog knew. Then, in the distance, engines, not roaring like before. Controlled, slow, purposeful. Rourke was back, and he had brought an army. The battle for Havenbrook. The first shot came fast. John heard it before it hit, a rifle round cracking through the air, slamming into a storefront just inches from where he stood. Then came the chaos. Rourke's men poured into town, rifles and shotguns flashing in the night, cutting through the darkness like lightning. Frank returned fire first, his sniper round taking out a man before he even stepped off his bike. Mike's shotgun boomed, taking down 2 more. John moved through the streets like a ghost, his pistol barking as he dropped another enemy. Max was a shadow in the chaos, moving in calculated strikes, taking men down, keeping John protected. Then, in the middle of it all, John heard the voice. "Carter!" Rourke. John turned toward the sound. And then, pain. Shot down. The bullet hit John's side, knocking him to the ground. Max snarled, stepping over him, his teeth bared. John gritted his teeth against the pain, pressing a hand to his wound. Rourke stepped forward, his rifle in his hands, his smirk returning. "End of the road, old man." John pushed himself up, but his vision swam. He was bleeding too fast. He wouldn't make it. Max lunged. Boom! A gunshot echoed through the streets. Not John's, not Rourke's. Rourke staggered back, a look of shock on his face. Then another shot, then another. John turned his head toward the sound, and his breath caught in his throat. Standing at the entrance of town, rifle smoking, eyes blazing with fury, was Rebecca Carter. A daughter's reckoning. Rourke stumbled, blood spreading across his chest. His men started falling back, retreating into the darkness. Rebecca took 3 more steps forward, rifle still locked on Rourke. She wasn't here to talk, she was here to finish it. Rourke's breath was shaky now. He dropped his rifle, hands trembling. John pushed himself to his feet, pain screaming through his side. His daughter's voice was steel. "You don't get to threaten my father." Then bang! The final shot ended it. Rourke's body hit the ground, and with it, the last threat to Havenbrook died. The war ends. By dawn, it was over. Rourke's men had fled, their leader gone. The town was still standing, bloodied, beaten, but standing. John sat on the steps of his home, Rebecca beside him, tending to his wound. "I told you to stay away," he muttered. She smiled softly. "Yeah, and I ignored you." Silence stretched between them. Then, "Thanks for saving my ass," John said. Rebecca smirked. "Any time, Dad." Max sighed heavily at John's feet, and for the first time in a long, long time, Havenbrook was safe. The sun rose over Havenbrook, casting golden light over a town that had survived hell itself. Smoke still clung to the buildings, the scars of battle etched into the storefronts, alleyways, and streets where blood had been spilled. But Havenbrook was still standing, and John Carter, for the first time in years, he wasn't standing alone. The morning after war, John sat on the porch of the diner, his injured side wrapped in fresh bandages, his breathing slow and steady. Max lay at his feet, exhausted but watchful. Across the street, Mike, Frank, Cole, and Eddie were helping the townsfolk clean up the last remnants of the fight. But John's focus was elsewhere. On Rebecca Carter, his daughter, standing near the gas station, talking with Emma Green. She hadn't been in Havenbrook for 10 years, and yet, last night, she had saved his life. John still wasn't sure how he felt about that. Rebecca turned toward him, her sharp blue eyes locking onto his. She had the same calculating look he did, the look of someone who had seen too much war to be impressed by it anymore. She walked over, stopping just short of the steps. "You look like hell," she said. John huffed. "I feel worse." A pause. Rebecca crossed her arms. "You gonna ask me why I came back?" John shrugged. "You already answered that last night." A smirk touched her lips. "Yeah, guess I did." Max stood up, stepping between them, tail wagging slightly. Rebecca crouched, scratching the dog behind his ears. "Still got your guardian angel, huh?" John exhaled. "Max is better company than most." Rebecca chuckled softly, but there was a weight behind it. "Why'd you really come back?" John asked finally. Rebecca's expression shifted, not uncomfortable, but not entirely open either. "Because," she said, standing back up, "I got the call. People were talking, and I figured maybe it was time." John studied her. His daughter had left a long time ago, and now she was here. "I'm glad you're alive," John muttered. Rebecca smiled. "Same, Dad. For now, that was enough." The cost of victory. By midday, the town watch gathered in the old church, the same place where they had first planned to fight back. The war was over, but now came the hard part. Rebuilding. John stood at the front, Max beside him. He couldn't see the faces in the room, but he could feel the weight of them. Emma, Tom Langley, Cole, Mike, Frank, Eddie, every single person who had fought to protect Havenbrook. "We won," John said. Silence followed. Then, from the back of the room, Tom cleared his throat. "But at what cost?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. John nodded. "That's what we need to talk about." He exhaled slowly. "We stopped Rourke. We stopped the Vultures. But people are still watching this town. People like Rourke. People like Viper before him, they don't just disappear. They'll hear what happened here. And eventually, his voice dropped lower, someone else is gonna come. A long, heavy pause. Mike crossed his arms. So what do we do? John straightened. We make sure Havenbrook is never a target again. A plan for the future. The Town Watch wasn't disbanding. If anything, it was getting stronger. Frank and Mike took over training new volunteers, people who never wanted to feel helpless again. Cole worked on fortifying the town, setting up barriers and checkpoints along every road leading into Havenbrook. Eddie met with the town's doctors and medics, ensuring they were stocked and prepared for anything. And John worked on something bigger. I want a direct line to the county sheriff, he told Mike. Mike frowned. You trust them? No, John admitted. But we don't have to trust them. We just need them to know that if someone tries to move against Havenbrook again, it's going to be a problem. Mike nodded. I'll handle it. John exhaled. And I need a full list of who's still in town. Emma arched a brow. You think there's someone left? John's jaw tightened. Rourke had men, he said. Some ran, some are dead, but some might still be here. The room went silent. Then Rebecca spoke. Then we find them. John turned toward her. You're staying? She smirked. Seems like you could use the help. John huffed. Fine. Because if anyone knew how to hunt ghosts, it was his daughter. The hunt for traitors. By sundown, John had a name. Ray Calhoun, one of Rourke's men. Never left town. And that meant only one thing. He had a reason to stay. John, Rebecca, and Mike moved fast, following the lead to a rundown shack on the outskirts of Havenbrook. Lights were on inside. Someone was waiting. John tilted his head. He's expecting us. Rebecca checked her pistol. Good. Mike kicked the door open. Inside, Ray Calhoun sat at a table, a cigarette burning between his fingers. He didn't even flinch. Well, Ray muttered, exhaling smoke. Took you long enough. John stepped forward. Why are you still here? Ray smirked. Because someone has to tell you what's coming next. The room went cold. John didn't move. Rebecca's grip on her gun tightened. Mike narrowed his eyes. What the hell does that mean? Ray exhaled another cloud of smoke. You thought Rourke was bad? He chuckled darkly. You have no idea who you pissed off. A long, thick silence. Then John spoke. Talk. The next threat. Ray leaned forward, his smirk vanishing. Rourke wasn't the end of this. Carter, he was just a messenger. John clenched his jaw. For who? Ray's gaze darkened. You ever hear of a man named Gabriel Knox? Mike went still. Rebecca stiffened. And John? John Carter felt the weight of that name hit him like a gunshot, because he knew it. Gabriel Knox wasn't just another gang leader. He was something worse. He was the kind of man who burned towns to the ground just to prove a point, and now he was coming for Havenbrook. John Carter had spent years fighting men who thought they were monsters. Some of them had been. But Gabriel Knox? He wasn't just a man. He was a storm, the kind that came without warning. The kind that didn't just kill. You never even saw it coming. And now he was coming for Havenbrook. John sat across from Ray Calhoun, the traitor who had just spoken Knox's name. The air in the room was thick with tension. Rebecca stood to his right, her gun hanging loosely at her side, but John knew she was ready to shoot at the first wrong move. Mike leaned against the wall, arms crossed, but his jaw was tight. And Ray was smirking. John didn't like that. Tell me, John said, his voice calm. Why is Knox coming? Ray exhaled smoke. Because of you. Silence. Then John leaned forward slightly. Try again, Ray chuckled. You think Havenbrook is just another town? That what happened with Rourke was just business? He shook his head. Knox runs a network, Carter. He controls entire counties. You think you just took out some gang? No, you killed an investment. The words sat heavy, and John understood immediately. Rourke had been part of something bigger. Havenbrook had just burned part of Knox's empire to the ground, and now the devil himself was coming to collect. Preparing for the worst, John left Ray tied up and under watch, then called for a town meeting. This time, The church was full. No more hesitation, no more fear. People knew what was coming. John stood at the front, Max at his feet, his voice steady. "This isn't over," he said. Murmurs spread. "We took down Rourke. We sent a message. But we didn't just fight off some gang. We cut into something bigger, and now someone worse is coming." The room grew still. Tom Langley, his face still bruised from Rourke's men, swallowed hard. "Who?" John exhaled. "Gabriel Knox." The name landed like a hammer. Even the people who didn't know it could feel the way it weighed the air down. Mike spoke up next. "We don't have much time. We need to do more than just prepare." Rebecca, standing near the back, crossed her arms. "We need to make this town impossible to take." A long silence. Then Emma Green stepped forward. "What do we do?" John nodded. And then the real work began, turning Havenbrook into a fortress. Over the next 4 days, the town transformed. This wasn't just setting up a defense. This was building a stronghold. Cole led teams to reinforce every building, welding steel over weak doors, blocking alleyways with concrete barriers. Frank trained snipers on the rooftops, men and women who had never held a gun before but were determined not to be victims again. Mike set up watch posts at every road leading into Havenbrook. Rebecca, she was tracking every possible entry point, looking for the cracks in their armor. John, he was getting ready for the hardest part, because if Knox was coming, he needed to do more than just wait for the attack. He needed to strike first. Hunting Ghost's night fell over Havenbrook. John, Rebecca and Mike moved silently through the dark, cutting across back roads, staying off the highways. They were going hunting. According to Ray, Knox's men had already sent scouts into the area. John had one mission: find them before they found Havenbrook. Tracking the enemy, Rebecca spotted the first sign of them. Tire tracks, fresh. Mike crouched down, running a hand over the dirt. "This is recent." John listened to the wind, the trees, the silence. Then he heard it. Engines. 1, 2, maybe 3. Rebecca pulled out a pair of binoculars, scanning the tree line. "There," she muttered. John turned toward her. "How many?" Rebecca focused. 3 vehicles, she murmured. "Looks like armored SUVs, black, tinted windows." Mike exhaled. "They're professional." John already knew. "We take them out," he said. Mike glanced at him. "You sure?" John's voice was cold. "They're scouts. If we don't stop them now, they'll come back with more." Mike didn't argue. Neither did Rebecca, because they all knew the truth. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was a war for survival, the first strike. The plan was simple. John took position on the ridge, his rifle resting against his shoulder. Rebecca and Mike moved closer, staying in the tree line. The SUVs were parked near an old service station, the men inside talking quietly, checking maps. "They're planning," Rebecca whispered. John exhaled. "Not anymore." The fight John took the first shot. The rifle cracked through the night, shattering the silence. The first man dropped instantly. Mike fired next, taking out the second before he could react. Then the headlights blazed to life, engines roared, men scrambled for weapons, but Rebecca was already moving, her pistol barking in the dark as she took out a third. John reloaded smoothly, heart steady. A man tried to run. Max was faster. The dog lunged, taking the man down hard. Then, just as fast as it started, it was over. 3 SUVs, 6 men down, and Havenbrook had just sent another message. The warning. John stood over one of the fallen men. His radio was still on. He picked it up. Static hissed. Then, "Report," a voice commanded. John brought the radio to his mouth. "They're dead." A long silence followed. Then the voice returned. "Hello, Carter." John's fingers tightened, because he knew that voice. Gabriel Knox. "I've heard a lot about you," Knox continued, his voice calm, almost amused. "You should have walked away, John. Now," his voice darkened, "now I burn your town to the ground." John's jaw clenched. Then he spoke. "You're welcome to try." Static. Then the radio went dead. John dropped it. Rebecca exhaled. "That's it then." Mike adjusted his grip on his rifle. "He's coming." John nodded once. "Let him." Havenbrook's last stand. By the time they got back, the town was waiting. No one had slept. Frank stood near the church, arms crossed. "How bad is it?" John exhaled. "Bad." The townsfolk looked between each other. They weren't afraid. Not anymore. They were angry. They were ready. John turned to them. "This is it," he said. "Knox is coming and we don't run." Tom Langley nodded. "Damn right we don't." Rebecca loaded a fresh magazine into her rifle. Mike checked his shotgun. Max stood tall and silent, waiting. Then John spoke again. "When Knox gets here," his voice was steel, "we end this." Havenbrook had survived 2 wars. First against the Black Vultures, a gang of thugs who thought they could bleed the town dry. Then against Rourke, a man who thought his empire was untouchable. But Gabriel Knox was different. He wasn't here to extort Havenbrook. He wasn't here to intimidate them. He was coming to erase them. The final preparations, John Carter didn't sleep. None of them did. The entire town had been fortified, but it wouldn't be enough if Knox came with everything he had. Rebecca, Mike, Frank, Cole, and Eddie spread out, reinforcing positions, ensuring that every road leading in was covered. "I count 3 main entry points," Frank reported from the rooftop near the gas station. "They'll use the highway first," Rebecca said. "But if we hold that, they'll cut through the service road by the lumber yard." Cole huffed. "Or worse. They'll send in scouts from the woods behind the school." John listened, processed, calculated. They weren't just up against a gang. Knox had resources. Mercenaries, ex-military types, men who knew how to take a town apart, piece by piece. "We need a contingency plan," John said. Mike frowned. "Like what?" John turned toward him, his voice cold. "If we lose the streets, we retreat to the center of town. We create a last stand here." He motioned toward the church. Frank nodded. "High ground, clear sightlines, limited entry points." Rebecca exhaled. "It's not a bad call." John's fingers tightened around his rifle. "We're not just defending Havenbrook," he murmured. "We're making sure they never come back." The first sightings. Just before dawn, Frank's voice crackled over the radio. "Movement on the highway." John was already awake. He pushed off his chair. Max instantly alert beside him. "How many?" John asked. Frank exhaled. "A lot." John, Mike, and Rebecca climbed to the water tower. Frank handed John his binoculars. John didn't need to see. He could hear them. Engines, dozens of them. Headlights flickered in the distance. Big trucks, armored SUVs. Not gang vehicles, war vehicles. Mike let out a slow breath. "Shit," John nodded. "They're here." Rebecca lowered her binoculars. "They're not rushing in." "Knox is watching us," John muttered. "Testing our response time." Frank adjusted his rifle scope. "Do we wait?" John exhaled. Then he clicked his radio. "All units, hold positions. Do not engage until they cross into town." Cole's voice came through. "Copy that." Eddie's followed. "Got it." John lowered the radio. Then he waited. The arrival. Just after sunset, they came. Not recklessly, not like the Black Vultures. Knox's men moved like trained wolves, spreading out, positioning themselves around the edges of town. They were coordinated, precise. John counted at least 40 men. Rebecca adjusted her rifle. "That's too many for a straight fight," Mike huffed. "We hold the ground we can. Make them bleed for every inch." John nodded. "We hold the line." Then, over the radio, "Carter!" A voice John hadn't heard in years. Knox, deep, calm, too calm. "You know why I'm here?" John raised the radio. "You're here because you think you can take this town." Knox chuckled. "I know I can." John exhaled. "Then come and try." Silence. Then gunfire erupted. The battle for Havenbrook. It started at the north barricade. Cole's voice crackled through the radio. "They're pushing hard on the highway!" John moved fast, heading toward the street where the first shots rang out. Max ran beside him, low and focused. John reached the front line, where Cole, Eddie, and a few of Havenbrook's own were firing back at advancing men. Shots cracked through the air, bullets slamming into wooden barricades and shattering windows. "They're pushing in fast," Cole shouted. John took cover behind a truck. Then, over the radio, "They're circling the service road." Rebecca's voice was sharp. "They're flanking." John gritted his teeth. Knox wasn't just sending muscle, he was sending tacticians. "Fall back to position 2, John ordered. His people moved fast, retreating to better ground, drawing Knox's men in deeper. John raised his rifle, took aim, and fired into the dark. One down, another. Then the explosion came. The trap his sprung Frank had been waiting. The second Knox's men moved into position, Frank's sniper took them apart. Then Cole triggered the explosives. A fireball ripped through the service road, throwing debris into the air. Men screamed, but the fight wasn't over. John heard engines revving in the distance. Rebecca's voice cut through the noise. "They're bringing in reinforcements." John clicked his radio. "All units fall back to the church." The last stand. By the time they reached the church, Knox's forces had pushed deeper into town. Frank's rifle cracked, covering the retreat. Mike and Cole barricaded the last road in. Eddie pulled back the wounded, getting them inside the church. John stood at the front, watching the battlefield shift. Knox's men had lost more than half their force, but they still had numbers. And Knox? He was finally coming. Face to face with the devil. The gunfire paused. Then, the sound of slow, heavy footsteps. Gabriel Knox walked down the street alone, his black coat covered in dust, his rifle resting over his shoulder. John stepped forward. Max growled at his side. Knox smiled. "Carter," he said, stopping 10 feet away. John tilted his head. "You've lost." Knox chuckled. "I've lost men." His smile vanished. "But you've lost everything else." John didn't move. Knox clicked his fingers. Then 2 of his men dragged someone forward. John's blood turned to ice. Tom Langley. They had taken him. Knox pulled a knife from his belt. "Put your guns down," he said, "or he dies." John clenched his fists. Then Rebecca's voice rang out. "Drop the knife!" Knox turned, and for the first time his smirk faltered, because behind John, the entire town was standing, rifles raised. Knox exhaled. "So this is how it ends." John's voice was steel. "It ends with you gone." Silence. Then Knox smiled. "Guess I was wrong about you, Carter." And then he was gone. The last truck disappeared into the night. And Havenbrook had survived again. John Carter had lived through too many battles to believe that this was truly the end. Gabriel Knox had left. For now. But men like Knox, they didn't just walk away. They regrouped. They planned. They came back when their enemies were weak. And Havenbrook had won, but at a cost. The aftermath. The sun rose over a town that had just survived its bloodiest night yet. The streets were littered with bullet casings, the buildings were scarred with gunfire and explosions, windows shattered, smoke still drifted from small fires that hadn't fully died out. The people of Havenbrook moved slowly, exhaustion pulling at them like weights, but no one was broken, no one was defeated. John stood near the church, Max at his side, watching as the town came together to clean up the wreckage. Mike walked up beside him, shaking his head. "We lost good people." John exhaled. "Yeah." Frank approached, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "But we held. Knox ran." John tilted his head slightly, listening. "No, he didn't run. He retreated." That was the difference, and that difference meant this wasn't over. A warning from the past. That afternoon, Rebecca found John sitting on the porch of the diner, drinking coffee. "You're thinking too much," she muttered, leaning against the railing. John chuckled softly. "You sound like your mother." Rebecca smirked. Maybe she was onto something. Silence stretched between them. Then she said, "You don't think Knox is really gone, do you?" John sighed, rubbing Max's head. "I know he ain't." Rebecca watched him. "You fought men like him before." John exhaled. "Not exactly. I fought worse." Rebecca sat down. "Tell me." John didn't speak for a long time. Then finally he said, During my second tour in Iraq, we took a town back from a warlord. Thought we won. Thought we saved the people. He took a sip of coffee. A month later, that warlord came back, burned the whole damn town to the ground. Rebecca was silent. John's voice was low. That's who Knox is. Rebecca's jaw clenched. Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance. John nodded. John, because this time he wouldn't let history repeat itself. The hunt begins. John wasn't going to wait for Knox to come back. He was going to find him first. Over the next few days, Havenbrook regrouped. The town rebuilt faster than anyone expected. Windows were boarded up, streets were cleaned, but the town watch didn't relax. Instead, they expanded. Mike set up patrol routes outside of town. Frank established a sniper rotation, ensuring that someone always had eyes on the roads. Cole reinforced the old factory, turning it into a fortified fallback point. And John started tracking Knox's movements. He had one lead, Ray Calhoun, the man who had warned them about Knox. John found him holed up in an abandoned cabin outside of town. John kicked the door open, Max at his side. Ray barely had time to react before John had him pinned to the wall. "You're gonna talk," John said, his voice cold. Ray's hands trembled. "You don't want to do this, Carter." John's grip tightened. "I don't want to. Boy, you must have missed the part where your boss put a target on my town." Ray swallowed hard. "Knox is already planning his next move." John knew it, but he needed details. "When?" John demanded. Ray exhaled sharply. 2 weeks. Maybe less. He's bringing reinforcements." John frowned. "From where?" Ray hesitated. John pressed harder. "From where, Ray?" Ray muttered. "Mexico." John stiffened. That was worse than he thought. The cartel connection. John, Mike, and Rebecca sat in the town hall, staring at the maps spread across the table. "Knox is pulling in cartel support," John said. Mike rubbed his face. "This just keeps getting worse." Rebecca tapped the map. "So that's his plan. Bring in outside muscle." John exhaled. "That means when he comes back it won't just be a gang war. It'll be an occupation." Frank, standing by the window, muttered, "We can't fight that kind of force on our own." John already knew that, which meant he had to do something he never wanted to do. "We need to call in federal backup." Mike frowned. "And how the hell do we do that?" John picked up his satellite phone and dialed an old number, a ghost from John's past. The phone rang twice. Then a voice answered. "Carter." John exhaled. "It's been a while, Dan." The man on the other end of the line was Daniel Briggs, a former federal marshal, a man John had once saved in a firefight that never made the news, and a man who owed John a favor. "I heard about Havenbrook," Briggs said. John leaned forward. "Then you know what's coming." Briggs was silent for a long time. Then finally, "I can get you some help, but it won't be official." John expected that. "I don't need a task force," he muttered. "I just need enough firepower to make Knox think twice." Briggs sighed. "All right, I'll see what I can do." John hung up. Rebecca arched a brow. "You trust this guy?" John smirked. "He trusts me. That's what matters." Knox's last warning. That night, John sat on his porch, listening. Max sat beside him, his breathing slow, steady. Then, a truck pulled up. John stood. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, holding something in his hands. John already knew what it was before the man spoke. "Knox says hi." The man dropped the bag onto the ground, then drove off. John stared at it. Then Rebecca and Mike came running out. Mike pulled open the bag, and his breath hitched. Inside was a human hand, a ring still on its finger. John knew that ring, because it belonged to Daniel Briggs. Rebecca swallowed. "Well, shit!" John clenched his jaw. Knox had gotten to Briggs first, and now it was personal. John turned toward the town. Then, quietly, he spoke. "We kill him." John Carter had spent his entire life hunting men like Gabriel Knox, men who thought power was a right, not something earned. Men who built empires out of fear, thinking no one would ever be bold enough to challenge them. Men who believed that their money, their connections, their reputation made them untouchable. John had buried plenty of men like that, and now it was Knox's turn. The blood price. The bag sat on the ground between them, stinking of death. A severed hand, fingers curled in rigor mortis, the silver federal ring still on its finger. Daniel Briggs had been a warning. Rebecca Carter exhaled sharply, staring at the bloody mess. Jesus Christ! Mike rubbed a hand down his face. This just got worse. Frank stood a few feet away, rifle slung over his shoulder. Briggs was the only backup we had. John's face was stone. No, he said quietly. We were the only backup we needed. The message was clear. Knox wasn't just coming back to take Havenbrook, he was coming to erase it, and that meant John had only one option left. Find him first, kill him first, end it before it even starts. Gathering the pack. That night, John called a closed-door meeting. Only the core team, Rebecca, Mike, Frank, Cole, and Eddie, sat around the heavy wooden table in the back of the church. John spread a map of the region across the table, marking it with 3 locations. These are the only places Knox could be operating from, John said. His men are still watching the roads, but they haven't made a full push yet. That means he's staging. Mike pointed at one of the marks. That's the abandoned mine outside of Red Hollow. Rebecca tapped another. And this? The old lumberyard past Route 42? John nodded. It was used by smugglers a decade ago, could be repurposed. Frank exhaled. What about the last one? John's jaw tightened. The ranch in Black Creek. Silence. Mike swore under his breath. Shit! Rebecca frowned. What's the problem? Cole leaned forward. Black Creek's cartel country. No one goes there unless they've got serious connections. John nodded. Which is why, if Knox is there, we're walking into hell itself. A long silence stretched. Then Rebecca smirked. Good, I was getting bored. The first move. They divided into 3 teams. Mike and Cole took the mine, moving at midnight to scout it out. Frank and Eddie took the lumberyard, watching for any cartel movement. John and Rebecca took Black Creek. John didn't like it. Bringing Rebecca into enemy territory wasn't his first choice, but he knew his daughter. She wasn't about to stay behind, and in Black Creek, they'd need someone just as ruthless as Knox's men. Into cartel country. The road to Black Creek was long and empty, stretching into the darkness like a path to the underworld. Rebecca drove, her hands steady on the wheel. Max sat in the back seat, silent, his golden eyes watching the shadows outside the window. John checked his pistol, then his rifle, then his knife. Rebecca smirked. You always do that. John didn't look up. Do what? The triple check. John sighed. Old habit. Rebecca's smirk faded slightly. From the war? John exhaled. From everywhere. She was quiet for a long time, then softly, You think we'll find him here? John stared ahead. If we do, he's dead before sunrise. Rebecca nodded. She didn't argue, because she felt the same way. The wolves of Black Creek. They arrived at 2 a.m., parking the truck in a shallow ravine half a mile from the ranch. John stepped out first, rifle in hand. Rebecca followed, moving low and quiet. Max trotted at John's side, ears perked, sniffing the air. Then, a voice in Spanish. Close. John froze. Rebecca went still beside him. Through the trees they saw them, 3 cartel enforcers, armed, smoking, laughing softly. John listened, analyzed. 2 pistols, one with a rifle slung over his back. Rebecca whispered, Take them. John shook his head. Not yet. They moved around, staying in the shadows, watching. The ranch house loomed in the distance, lights flickering inside. John's gut tightened. This was it. Knox was here. A silent death. They needed to clear the patrol first. John signaled Rebecca. She nodded. The first cartel enforcer never saw the knife. John moved fast, his blade slicing clean across the throat, catching the man before he could fall. Rebecca shot the second one, a single silenced shot to the head. The third. He turned. Max lunged, teeth flashing in the dark, clamping onto the man's arm before he could scream. John finished him with a single bullet to the skull. The bodies hit the dirt. No noise, no alarm, just death in the night. Inside the lion's den, John and Rebecca moved toward the ranch, slipping through the back entrance. Inside, voices echoed through the halls. Knox was here, they could feel it. Then a voice, low, sharp, controlled. "Carter!" John's blood went cold. Knox was waiting. The final showdown. John stepped into the main room, rifle raised. Knox sat at a table smiling, a pistol resting in front of him. 4 mercenaries stood nearby, weapons ready. John exhaled slowly. Rebecca took position behind cover, gun aimed at one of the guards. Knox leaned back. "I knew you'd come." John didn't blink. "Let's end this." Knox chuckled. "You sound like you think you're in control." John's voice was ice. "I don't think, I know." Knox's smile faded slightly. Then John fired. The room exploded into chaos. Rebecca dropped the first guard with a headshot. Max lunged, taking down another. John moved fast, putting 2 rounds into the closest mercenary. Knox dived for his pistol. John kicked the table over, knocking it into him. Gunfire ripped through the room, wood splintering, glass shattering. Rebecca ducked behind a pillar, firing at the last guard. John grabbed Knox by the collar, slamming him against the wall. Knox smirked, blood dripping from his nose. "You don't have the guts." John pressed his pistol to Knox's forehead. "Watch me." Knox's smirk vanished. Then boom! John pulled the trigger, and Gabriel Knox was gone. The end of an era. By sunrise, John and Rebecca were back in Havenbrook. The town was still standing. The war was finally over. Mike clapped John on the shoulder. "You did it!" John exhaled. "We did." Rebecca leaned against the truck, arms crossed. "So, what now?" John looked at his town, his home, and for the first time in years, he didn't know. Maybe that was the best part. The morning after Knox's death, Havenbrook was silent. Not the kind of silence that came from fear or loss, but something else, something deeper. The town had survived, but it hadn't come out unscathed. The scars were still fresh, on the buildings, on the streets, and in the hearts of the people who had fought to keep this place alive. John Carter sat on his porch, one hand resting on Max's head, the other wrapped around a mug of strong, black coffee. His ribs ached from bruises he hadn't had time to feel during the fight. His shoulder wound burned, though Rebecca had done a decent job stitching it up the night before. But the worst pain, it wasn't physical. It was the weight of knowing what they had done, and worse, knowing it might not be over. The cost of blood. Mike and Rebecca arrived just after sunrise. Mike carried a clipboard full of damage reports, his face hard and unreadable. Rebecca held a radio in one hand, her thumb hovering over the button. John raised an eyebrow. "Bad news first," Mike sighed, flipping through pages. 3 buildings completely destroyed. 4 others need heavy repairs. A handful of farms outside town got hit during the first wave. The gas station still standing, but barely. John nodded, absorbing it all. "And the people?" Mike's jaw tightened. 5 dead, 9 wounded. John closed his eyes for a moment. He had known it would be bad, but knowing and hearing it said out loud were 2 different things. Rebecca exhaled sharply. "We got lucky." John tilted his head toward her. "That what you call this?" Rebecca's grip on the radio tightened. "I call it not losing." John nodded. She wasn't wrong. But victory didn't come without a price. A town that refuses to die. By midday, the people of Havenbrook had already started rebuilding. Hammers echoed through the streets. Smoke curled from chimneys where fires had been restarted. The town watch was still patrolling, watching the roads, watching the horizon, waiting for something worse to come. Emma Green stood outside her diner, sweeping shattered glass off the porch. Tom Langley, his arm still in a sling, supervised the repairs on the bakery. Frank and Cole were helping reinforce the church, making sure it would hold if another war ever came. John walked through the center of town, listening to the sounds of survival. Rebecca matched his pace. "You ever seen anything like this?" John exhaled. "Yeah." Rebecca arched an eyebrow. "And?" John stopped, his boot scraping against the dirt. "And it never lasts." Rebecca frowned. "Why?" John turned toward her, his expression unreadable. Because there's always another fight. Rebecca studied him for a long moment. Not this time. John wasn't so sure. The shadows that remain. As the sun started to set, Mike's voice crackled over the radio. "John, we found something." John grabbed the radio. "Where?" Mike's tone was sharp. "The woods." John was already moving. The last secret of Havenbrook. They found the bodies first. 3 men, all of them shot execution style, dumped in a shallow grave near the edge of town. Frank stood nearby, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "Looks fresh, maybe a day old." Cole frowned. "Knox's men?" John studied the scene. Then he saw it. The tattoos. The markings of a cartel. Rebecca's expression darkened. "He brought more than just mercenaries." Mike sighed. "But if they're dead," John interrupted, "it means someone else killed them." A long silence stretched between them. Then Rebecca spoke. "So the question is, who?" The return of a ghost. That night, a truck rolled into Havenbrook. It was battered, covered in dirt and bullet holes. John stood at the center of town, watching as the driver's door swung open. The man who stepped out was tall, lean and scarred. His beard was trimmed short, his hair graying at the edges. His eyes were sharp, too sharp. John recognized him instantly. "Victor Fuentes," Mike swore. Rebecca stiffened. Frank reached for his rifle. Because Victor Fuentes wasn't just anyone. He was a legend in the criminal world, a former cartel enforcer, a man rumored to have disappeared years ago. Now he was standing in Havenbrook, and that could only mean one thing. The fight wasn't over. A deal with the devil. Fuentes leaned against his truck, lighting a cigarette. "You look good, Carter." John didn't move. "Can't say the same for you." Fuentes chuckled. "Fair enough." Rebecca's voice was cold. "Why are you here?" Fuentes took a slow drag, exhaled the smoke, then flicked the cigarette onto the ground. "Because," he said, finally getting to the point, "I know what Knox was planning." John's muscles tensed. Fuentes gestured toward the woods. "Those bodies you found, they weren't his men." Mike frowned. "Then who were they?" Fuentes smirked. "People sent to kill him. The real threat." John had thought Knox was the end of the fight. He had been wrong. Knox had crossed a line. He had been trying to build something bigger, something that had caught the attention of the wrong people. Fuentes explained it all. "There's a new player moving into the territory," he said. "They're bigger than Knox. Smarter, more dangerous." John exhaled. "A cartel?" Fuentes shook his head. "No, worse." The words hit like a hammer. John knew what that meant. This wasn't just about crime anymore. This was about power, control, an empire. Knox had been playing a game too big for him, and now the real monsters were coming. A new war looms. John stood at the edge of Havenbrook, looking out at the dark road stretching toward the horizon. Rebecca stepped up beside him. "What do we do?" she asked. John's jaw clenched. Fuentes had given them one last warning before leaving. "You have 2 choices, Carter. You can run, or you can prepare for the kind of war you've never seen before." John wasn't a man who ran. His voice was calm. "We get ready." Rebecca exhaled. "For what?" John turned toward her. "For the next war." Because Havenbrook wasn't safe yet, not even close. John Carter had fought in 2 wars, one on the battlefield and one in the streets of Havenbrook. He had survived both, but now he faced something far worse. Knox was dead, but his war hadn't died with him. Because Havenbrook had just stumbled into a bigger fight, a fight against men whose names weren't spoken, whose reach extended far beyond small-town gangs and mercenaries. And now John had a decision to make: run or fight. He never had been much of a runner. The warning that changed everything. The sun barely crested the horizon when Victor Fuentes walked back into town. John met him at the diner, sitting across from the cartel enforcer-turned-ghost. A man who had disappeared years ago, only to resurface now, when Havenbrook stood at the edge of something worse. Max lay at John's feet, ears twitching, muscles tense. Fuentes stirred his coffee, watching John carefully. "You don't seem surprised to see me again," he murmured. John exhaled. "I was expecting you sooner." Fuentes chuckled. "Fair enough." He took a sip of his coffee. Then, "You ever hear the name Miguel Herrera?" John frowned. Mike, sitting beside him, shifted uncomfortably. Rebecca, standing behind them, crossed her arms. "Sounds familiar," Fuentes nodded. "It should. He's the reason I disappeared." John knew what that meant. If Fuentes had vanished, it wasn't because he ran. It was because he was forced to. The devil in Mexico. Miguel Herrera wasn't a gang leader. He wasn't a cartel boss. He was something worse, the kind of man who didn't just run an empire. He built them, brick by bloody brick. Knox had been nothing compared to Herrera, and now he was coming for Havenbrook. Fuentes set his coffee down. "Knox was working for him. That's why I killed those men in the woods." John stared at him. "You killed cartel soldiers?" Fuentes nodded. "Had to. They weren't here to help Knox. They were here to replace him." The realization hit like a gunshot. Knox hadn't just hired cartel muscle. He had been playing middleman, trying to merge Havenbrook into Herrera's operations. Now that Knox was gone, Herrera wasn't just sending men. He was coming himself. The weight of a choice. John walked through Havenbrook, the weight of Fuentes' words pressing heavily on his chest. The town had barely survived Knox. How the hell were they supposed to survive a man like Herrera? Mike caught up to him outside the general store, his face dark. "What are we thinking?" John exhaled. "We're thinking we don't have enough firepower for this." Mike nodded slowly. "So what do we do?" John thought for a long moment. Then he spoke. "We call for help." Mike's eyebrows raised. "From who?" John's jaw tightened. "From men who hate Herrera even more than we do." Calling in old debts. That night, John made 3 calls. Call number 1, to an outlaw. John dialed the first number. The voice that answered was low, sharp, and amused. "Carter," the man said, "didn't think I'd ever hear from you again." John leaned against the counter. "We need to talk, Finn." Finn McAllister. Former outlaw, former gunrunner, and a man who had a deep personal hatred for Herrera. Finn sighed. "This about Knox?" "No," John murmured. "It's about who was behind him." A long silence. Then Finn exhaled sharply. "You're really picking this fight?" John's voice was cold. "It already picked me." Finn chuckled. "All right, I'll be there in 2 days." Call number 2. To an old friend. The second call was more complicated. John hadn't spoken to Raymond Ghost Harrison in years, not since the war. The phone rang 4 times before a voice finally answered. "Carter," John exhaled. "I need a favor." A long pause. Then, softly, "You're calling in the debt?" John closed his eyes. "Yeah." Another long pause. Then Ghost said, "I'll be there by sunrise." Call number 3, to the only authority he trusted. The last call was the hardest. Sheriff Walt Grayson wasn't a man John particularly liked, but he wasn't corrupt, which made him a rare breed. When Grayson picked up, his voice was already tired. "Carter," he muttered, "what the hell do you want?" John didn't waste time. "We've got cartel problems." Grayson swore. "Christ, you sure?" John exhaled. "I'm sure." The sheriff was silent for a long time. Then, "I'll see what I can do." John hung up. Now? Now all he could do was wait. The reinforcements arrived by the next morning. Havenbrook had visitors. The first to arrive was Finn McAllister, rolling into town in a black pickup, dust trailing behind him. He stepped out dressed in a worn leather jacket, 2 pistols strapped to his belt. "Jesus," he muttered, looking around. "You sure know how to pick a fight, Carter." The second was Ghost, a man who barely looked like he belonged in this world anymore. He was tall, lean, covered in scars, his eyes cold and dead. He stepped out of his vehicle, met John's gaze, and simply nodded. The last to arrive was Sheriff Grayson. He pulled up in an unmarked cruiser, his face grim. "We're on our own," he muttered. "The feds won't touch this." John expected that. Mike stood beside him, staring at the men who had just come to help save Havenbrook. "This is it?" he asked. John nodded. "This is it. The last sunrise before war." As the sun set over Havenbrook, the town stood quiet, waiting. John sat outside the diner, cleaning his rifle, listening to the sounds of preparation. Rebecca sat beside him, loading magazines. "How many do you think they'll send?" John sighed. "More than enough." She glanced at him. "You think we can win?" John was quiet for a long time. Then finally, "We have to." She nodded. Max shifted at John's feet, ears perking. The dog knew. They all did. Tomorrow, the cartel came to Havenbrook, and this time there wouldn't be another fight after this. This time it was for everything. Havenbrook had fought 2 wars already. One against the Black Vultures, a gang that thought they could bully a small town into submission. Another against Gabriel Knox, a man who thought his money and connections made him untouchable. But this was something else. The cartel was coming. Not with thugs on bikes, not with mercenaries looking for a paycheck. This was organized, calculated, ruthless. And John Carter knew one thing for certain. If they lost this fight, there wouldn't be another Havenbrook left to save. The final preparations. It had been 3 days since Victor Fuentes had warned them about Miguel Herrera. 3 days since John made his calls. Now, they had less than 24 hours before the cartel moved in. John stood at the center of town, staring down at the map spread across the hood of an old truck. Mike leaned over the other side, arms crossed. "So how do we do this?" John ran a finger across the map, marking key points. "They'll come from 3 directions," he said. "The main highway, the service road through the forest, and the old railroad tracks." Rebecca nodded, loading another magazine. "They'll have snipers, probably spotters." Frank adjusted his rifle. "Then we take them out first." Cole, tightening the barbed wire barricades near the entrance to town, grunted, "I still don't like this." John exhaled. "None of us do." Cole shook his head. "That's not what I mean. I don't like that we're fighting on our turf." John looked at him. Cole continued, "We should be taking the fight to them." John agreed, but there was no time. Havenbrook was out of options. Now, they just had to survive. The last sundown. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew heavy. People were silent, waiting. Finn McAllister checked his pistols. "How many we thinking?" John sighed. "Enough." Ghost adjusted his body armor, his scarred face unreadable. "Then we'd better be ready." Sheriff Walt Grayson watched the roads, his hand tight on his shotgun. John walked through town, watching the people he had spent his life protecting. This wasn't just about Havenbrook anymore. This was about making sure no one ever tried this again. John stopped outside the church, where Emma Green and the other civilians had gathered for safety. She met his eyes. "Are we gonna make it?" she asked softly. John didn't lie. "I don't know," he admitted. Emma nodded. "Then you'd better give them hell." John's jaw tightened. That was the plan. The first shot. It started at midnight. Frank's voice cut through the radio. "Movement on the highway." John's breath steadied. Then, the first gunshot rang out. Frank took down the first cartel scout before he could even radio in. Then, all hell broke loose. Engines roared, headlights flashed in the dark, illuminating dozens of cartel soldiers moving in formation. They weren't gangsters with pistols. They were professionals, moving like a military unit. John's radio crackled. "They're pushing up the main road," Mike called. John raised his rifle. "Hold the line," he ordered. Then he fired. The streets turned red. The first wave hit hard. Cartel gunmen moved fast, taking cover behind vehicles, laying down suppressive fire. John's team returned fire, picking off men with precision and strategy. Max snarled, lunging at a soldier who got too close. Rebecca took down 2 men in quick succession, moving like she had been born for war. Mike and Cole covered the right flank, unleashing shotgun blasts that turned bodies into pulp. Then an explosion tore through the barricade. John hit the ground as flames roared into the night sky. "Breach! They're coming through!" John's vision blurred as he pushed himself up, ears ringing. Max was at his side, barking frantically. John shook off the shock. Then he grabbed his rifle and started shooting again. House-to-house warfare. The cartel pushed into town, using the flames and smoke as cover. John's men fell back, regrouping near the diner and general store. Finn tossed a Molotov, setting an abandoned truck on fire, blocking part of the street. Ghost moved through the alleyways, killing from the shadows. Sheriff Grayson and his deputies held the school, cutting down enemies who got too close, but the cartel kept coming. John heard them before he saw them. Heavy boots, low voices, military signals. They were sending in their best. John exhaled. Then he whispered, "Let's finish this." The last stand at the church by 4 a.m., they had been pushed back to the church. John's team held the high ground, but the cartel was surrounding them, closing in like a tightening noose. The radio crackled. Rebecca's voice was sharp. "We're running out of ammo." John clenched his jaw. "Then we make every bullet count." The cartel's leader stepped forward, dressed in black tactical gear, carrying a gold-plated pistol, his cold eyes scanning the battlefield. Miguel Herrera. John raised his rifle, aiming at his head. Before he could pull the trigger, Herrera spoke. "Carter!" His voice echoed in the night. John didn't answer. Herrera smirked. "You've put up a good fight, but it ends here." John exhaled slowly. "You want me?" he called back. "Come and get me." Herrera nodded. And then the final assault began. The bloodiest hour. They came like a wave of death. John's team fired until their guns clicked empty. Bodies piled up in the streets. Max lunged and tore through enemies, refusing to let them get close to John. Cole was hit, but he kept fighting. Frank ran out of rifle rounds and switched to his revolver, every shot hitting its mark. Then Herrera's men breached the church doors. John spun, knife flashing. Rebecca fired at point-blank range. Sheriff Grayson took a bullet to the leg, still pulling the trigger as he fell. Then in the middle of it all, Herrera stepped inside. And for the first time, John and Herrera stood face to face. The end of a war. Herrera raised his gold-plated pistol, smirking. "You lose, Carter." John exhaled. "No." Then Max lunged. Herrera stumbled back, gun firing into the ceiling as the dog clamped down on his arm. John moved fast, grabbing Herrera's fallen weapon. The cartel leader's eyes widened. John pulled the trigger. Bang! Miguel Herrera fell. The battle was over, and Havenbrook still stood, a town that refuses to die. By sunrise, the cartel was gone. John stood in the middle of the street, Max beside him, watching as the people of Havenbrook emerged from the ruins. Rebecca leaned against a truck, breathing hard. Mike sat on the church steps, wrapping his arm with a bloody rag. Frank reloaded his revolver. Cole wiped blood from his face, looking at John. "Is it over?" he asked. John stared at the horizon. Then he exhaled. For now. Because Havenbrook would always be a place worth fighting for, and as long as he breathed, John Carter would always be its protector.